the federal government's battle to disrupt the flow of drugs into this country. It's a costly and often futile exercise for law enforcement agencies. We have a report from Spencer Michaels of public station KQED, San Francisco.
Good afternoon, Skipper. This is the United States Coast Guard. We're going to be placing a boarding party aboard your vessel this afternoon to ensure your compliance with all federal regulations applicable to your boat. Bring your boat dead in the water, please. Thank you.
What they're really looking for is drugs, marijuana and cocaine smuggled into the U.S. from South America and Asia. San Francisco Bay may not look like a war zone, but this is the western front of the Reagan administration's war on drugs. And it is a real war, complete with an Air Force and a Navy. Since 1981, federal funding for drug interdiction has tripled to over $1 billion. The government boasts of its victories and shows off the booty. But huge amounts of drugs continue to arrive. Florida smuggler Bruce Perlowan, now serving a 15-year sentence at the Pleasanton Federal Prison, moved to California in 1978. Until his arrest in 1983, he ran the largest marijuana smuggling operation on the West Coast. Perlowan commanded a fleet of more than 90 boats, some carrying drugs, some for protection, to bring more than 300,000 pounds of marijuana from Colombia and Thailand to San Francisco Bay. He offloaded the marijuana at this dock that he owned, right next to the Richmond Bridge.
Your average crew gets paid $300,000. The offloaders at the dock, which there's a dozen of them, got $12,500 a night. All these lookouts got between $2,000 and $5,000 a night for just looking out for one night. And various other personnel, generals and majors who were doing things, the radio men, they all got paid. So he averaged it out to about $100 a pound. So that leaves me $200 a pound profit. For 30,000 pounds is $6 million.
Perlowan told producer Philippa Carmel that even after he was arrested, his operation continued. 2 loads arrived while he was in prison. Altogether, he had brought more than $500 million worth of pot into the Bay. Now, intelligence officials say others have taken his place.
I believe that there are a number of organizations operating along the West Coast at this time who are at least the size or bigger than Perlowan's organization. We've seen a switch to more Thai marijuana along the Northern California, Oregon, Washington coast, and we've seen more cocaine loads also. Send another C-130 out or patrol for tomorrow.
With 1,100 miles of California coastline to patrol, catching smugglers is nearly impossible. Last June, the Coast Guard got lucky at an isolated cove near Gold Beach, Oregon. Tipped off by a local resident, they caught smugglers in the act of offloading bales of Thai marijuana. The fishing boat, the California Sun, ran aground as its crew tried to escape, dumping much of its 7-ton load into the sea. The smugglers are believed to have successfully brought in other loads of marijuana and cocaine, including a large load of cocaine allegedly brought right into Fisherman's Wharf on this boat, the Midnight Sun. The same month, during a random boarding, the Coast Guard struck contraband on this British yacht, which was boarded just west of Big Sur on its way from Hong Kong to San Francisco. Officers discovered 346 bales of high-quality Thai marijuana on the yacht, worth an estimated $12 million. Seizure figures since 1982 suggest that there's been a significant drop in marijuana smuggling. But cocaine seizures have increased 5-fold, indicating a tremendous jump in cocaine smuggling. While some smugglers favor small boats, others conceal their drug shipments in giant container ships and commercial air carriers. With an average of 1,000 containers passing through the port of Oakland each day, the Customs Service here has the almost impossible task of screening out shipments of drugs. Realistically, they can inspect less than 3% of the cargo.
We're finding a lot of cocaine, but there's a lot of cocaine in the country. And the estimates now are saying that we're interdicting 10 to 15%. Heroin's 2 to 3% of what they estimate is going to be on the street this year is all we're seizing. And marijuana, nobody knows. There's so much out there. Nobody really knows. We find a lot, but there's a lot out there.
This was a training exercise, and the dog found the hidden heroin. But dope secreted by smugglers is only occasionally sniffed out.
Rarely do we find narcotics just on a cold hit. It almost never happens that we walk into a warehouse such as this and stumble across a shipment of drugs. The smuggling operations are too sophisticated for that.
As Customs steps up enforcement efforts, smugglers turn to more ingenious methods of concealing drugs. Last May, Customs inspected a suspiciously small shipment of lumber from Bolivia and found 8.5 pounds of cocaine secreted in the wood. In June, inspectors broke open a shipment of dishes from Bangkok and discovered 28 pounds of heroin sealed inside the plates.
They have unlimited resources. Their budgets are a lot bigger than ours are, and they always will be. The more money we spend, the more money they'll spend. I don't think we can outspend them.
In fact, agents can detect and seize only a small amount of the drugs smuggled into the U.S., according to a new report by the Government Accounting Office. But U.S. Attorney Joe Rusinello defends drug interdiction despite the low seizure rate.
Interdiction is still important for the significant reason that it gives us, the traffickers. It's not so much the amount of dope that's seized that's important, but the people who are involved in the trafficking.
8 federal agencies make up a special drug task force formed to prosecute the kingpins of large drug rings.
We're trying to take down the major drug trafficking organizations, unwind them, put them out of business, eliminate them. We think that every time we're able to take out a major organization, there are people who are quick to rush to fill the vacuum, but they're amateurs.
Rusinello says successful prosecutions plus greatly increased sentences have begun to take a toll on drug traffickers.
37% of the federal prison population is drug trafficking, as opposed to 17%, which is what it was in 1981. And we've increased the number of federal prison inmates by about 15,000 since 1981. So we have more major drug traffickers in prison and for longer sentences. And what that generally shows is that to the enterprising young person who might be thinking of it as a career, that there's a price to pay, and that the price to pay may be 10, 15, 20 years in prison.
The drug scene has changed dramatically since the 1960s, when much of the drugs were grown or imported by hippies and small-time dealers. Today, those elements are disappearing, and according to defense attorney Tony Serra, overzealous government enforcement has produced a tougher, more violent breed of drug smugglers.
It's no longer, the adventuresome, no longer the romantic, no longer the individual entrepreneur. The federal government, through its raising of the risk, that is the increased penalties, through the increased law enforcement efforts, has pushed smuggling into the realm of organized crime.
As cocaine became more and more of the prevalent drug smuggled in, because enforcement was easier at finding the large loads, you started attracting more of the thugs, more of the violent people, more of the criminal element. I don't consider the hippies who smuggled in marijuana a criminal element. I consider a lot of what's happening now criminal element.
These fellows who may have been smuggling marijuana from Thailand or other places, who were doing it as lark and frolic and thought that it was fun in the sun, and who are now going to get into the cocaine business, are going to run smack up against the cartel. And if they think that they're going to go in competition with these other folks on a kind of friendly arm's length competitive basis, they're sorely mistaken. They're going to find some pretty ruthless people out there. And if in the process they kill each other off, well, there won't be any tears shed over here.
The rhetoric is tough in the war on drugs, and occasionally in some battles there have been victories. Smugglers have been caught, but the supply of drugs remains plentiful and the war goes on.
The Latin America drug connection is where our major attention goes tonight. The State Department issued a major report on the subject today as part of a process aimed at denying U.S. aid to countries that fail to act against drug trafficking. It's a story of politics and murder, corruption and revolution, a story that grows more sensational with most passing recent days. Correspondent Charles Krause has some opening background.
2 years ago, the Reagan administration sent 150 GIs and 6 Army helicopters to Bolivia. It was one highly visible part of a $16 billion campaign to stop the flow of illegal drugs from Latin America to the United States. But like so many other battles in the war on drugs, Operation Blast Furnace was largely a failure. 6 months after they came, the GIs were withdrawn, and in cities like Cochabamba, Bolivian drug dealers are back in business. Today, the administration admits Bolivia has regained its place as a key source of coca leaves for Colombia's drug mafia, and concedes there's more cocaine available in the United States than ever before. The cocaine trail begins here in Bolivia and in neighboring Peru. Thousands of small farmers grow coca leaves, which are then processed chemically at crude and often clandestine laboratories into coca paste. The paste is then flown north by small plane to Colombia, where the drug mafia, known as the Medellin cartel, processes the paste into pure cocaine. The white powder, by some estimates 200,000 pounds a year, is then smuggled by land, by boat, and by air from Colombia through Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean to the United States. According to recent congressional testimony, the vast smuggling network controlled by Colombia's drug lords has more resources than most of the governments trying to stop it. Until his arrest in 1983, Ramon Milian Rodriguez laundered drug money. By his own admission, more than $2 billion a year for the Medellin cartel.
Every Central and South American country now, without exception, has a group of people that are dependent on the cartel. The cartel does not just control drugs. It controls industries, not factories, industries.
According to today's State Department report and other U.S. government sources, the cartel's influence extends to at least 14 countries, from Mexico to Paraguay. To obtain safe passage for cocaine, the cartel reportedly spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year corrupting police, military, and other government officials in these countries. Those officials who won't be bought or bribed, men like Carlos Hoyos Jimenez, Colombia's Attorney General, are often killed. Drug-related crime and corruption is increasing, threatening to further undermine already weak and corrupt governments throughout the hemisphere. Among the most notorious, Panama's military regime run by General Manuel Noriega. Rodriguez told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee he personally handled payments to General Noriega, at one point averaging $10 million a month.
Did you receive a specific instruction through General Noriega?
Yes, sir. We received specific instructions and we carried them out.
Okay, and the carrying out involved what? Placing money in a specific account somewhere or in Panama?
Placing money in specific accounts, in specific companies, and sometimes cash payments.
But until very recently, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration maintained that Noriega was a valuable ally, cooperating fully with DEA efforts to curtail the flow of drugs through Panama to the United States. Interviewed last May, Alfredo Duncan, chief of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Office in Panama, flatly denied allegations that Noriega was being paid off by the drug mafia.
I could say 100% of the time these allegations prove to be unfounded, or it's determined that it's just that doesn't merit any further inquiry.
But last month, General Noriega was indicted in Florida by U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner.
They are destroying our children with the narcotics, and that has to stop. And that's why I indicted this case.
And today at the State Department, Panama was one of 4 countries found not to be cooperating with the administration's war on drugs. Nonetheless, apparently because of U.S. military bases in Panama and the Panama Canal, President Reagan decided not to impose new economic sanctions on Noriega, at least for now.
For more on the State Department's report, we turn to Anne Wroblewski, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics Matters. Madam Secretary, why no sanctions against Noriega?
Well, I think the key is no sanctions right now. What we said was that all of the automatic sanctions that are taken as a result of the legislation have been taken. The discretionary sanctions are just that, discretionary, optional. And we'd like to see how events play out over the next several weeks, the 45 days that Congress has to examine the president's certification before we make any decisions on further sanctions.
I see. I don't know whether you heard it, but on our news summary a moment ago, Senator D'Amato, who's on the committee that held the hearings recently, said this isn't conducting a war. Your report is just paying lip service to this problem. How do you reply to that?
Well, I think Senator D'Amato is, of course, entitled to his opinion. But in my view, this report is frank and it's candid, and I expect that it will tell the test of time. We were last year congratulated on the Hill for the frankness and the candor of our report, and I think that today's report doesn't pull any punches.
Is drug control a prime foreign policy priority within the State Department, or is it always going to be subordinated to other factors in U.S. relations with these various countries?
Well, I think clearly when you look at particularly the Andes, Central America, Eastern Caribbean countries, that it is a clear priority in terms of foreign policy.
A dominant priority?
Well, I would say so. When you look at the power of the Medellin cartel, which your piece, I think, clearly indicated, is substantial. And if you think about the foreign policy concerns, the security concerns, the national security concerns of some of our friends and allies in the region, they are under attack by the Medellin cartel. And therefore, it is an issue that we pay increasing attention to, both the President, the Secretary of State, on down through the Department.
We get the impression, watching the hearings a couple of weeks ago, that sometimes, at least it appears to outsiders like us, that the right hand of the U.S. government doesn't know what the left hand of the U.S. government is doing. Take reference Panama in terms of drug control. Is that at all true, and if so, is it frustrating to you?
Well, I think that what you have are a few enforcement agencies, certainly the Drug Enforcement Agency, who has asked the Panamanian government, General Noriega specifically, for help on some specific cases and some specific issues. And that help has been forthcoming. And they therefore speak to that kind of cooperation. My view, and I think the view of the larger narcotics community, is that if you're going to indict General Noriega, as a grand jury has done, it calls into question those specific instances of cooperation. But it doesn't make them go away. They've gotten help on a few things that they have asked the general to help them out with.
Do you find yourself trying to do your own job in a lot of disputes with other parts of the U.S. government?
No, I wouldn't say so. I would say clearly that the narcotics community has come of age as the issue has become more important, particularly in the foreign policy spectrum, and that we don't often come to the table with differences of opinion.
Just to come back to Noriega for a moment, Robert Morgenthau, the Manhattan district attorney, told those hearings that I referred to that lots of people have known about Noriega's alleged role in the drug thing for a long time, but that high U.S. officials, for other reasons of policy, didn't want to blow the whistle on him. Is that fair?
Well, I think there's a difference between, quote, knowing about a role, whatever that means, and having evidence that leads to an indictment. And I think that when we got the evidence together that led to an indictment, we proceeded with that indictment, just as we've done on several other cases. There's a difference between rumor and indictable offenses.
I see. Well, thank you. Jim?
Next, the views of Senator John Kerry, Democrat of Massachusetts. He chairs the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Communications, which held those recent hearings on the drug operations in Panama, among other things. Senator, first, what do you think of today's actions by the State Department, as just explained by Madam Secretary Robleski?
Well, the thing that I agree with her on is that there is some candor in the report. What troubles me is that there's an enormous gulf between what the words say and the message that they carry and the decision that is then made as to certification or non-certification. I think that there just isn't a real understanding in the State Department and perhaps in other agencies of this administration as to what ought to be done here. And the problem is that you've got law enforcement officials in DEA, Customs, police units around the country who are struggling with something And the message being sent by the administration as a result of this report and last year's report is a divergence with their efforts and with the real needs of the country.
How does that, where's the divergence?
The divergence is that if you are serious about a war on drugs, which I think most people are, but if you're going to carry that into effect, you can't not take significant sanctions against a General Noriega. The other problem, I think, with the report
is... But they've
is...
indicted the man.
That's exactly the point. But no, that's not a sanction because you're not bringing him to trial, and you know, and he knows that he probably won't come to trial. So the question is, what message do you send the Panamanian people? And the divergence in this report is also a divergence of the degree to which the administration really understands what's happening in each of these countries. Let me be specific. Last year, their report, and I read it, said about Panama, there is no convincing evidence, however, that Panamanian authorities support drug trafficking as a matter of institutional policy. 1 year later, we get a report which decertifies Panama. Now, the Secretary just said there's a difference between rumor and indictable offense. My complaint, and the complaint, I think, of a number of people on the Hill, is that last year many of us knew there was an indictable offense. Many of us knew the evidence. The evidence has been around for a long time. And the question must be asked, why, in view of all of that evidence, in view of Cy Hirsch's story in the New York Times last June, did the grand jury not convene then? Did the witnesses not get talked to then? I was talking to those witnesses last year. It wasn't until this year the administration put them in front of the grand jury.
All right. On the specific issue of sanctions against Panama, what should the president have announced today instead of what he did announce?
Well, Panama has had a series of transitions under General Noriega. He's kicked out presidents before. The Panamanian people are used to this, and they are used to the United States supporting General Noriega. So if we come out with a business-as-usual report, oh no, we're going to wait and see what happens, we are essentially saying to the Panamanian people, maybe it isn't so wise to go out in the streets. Maybe we shouldn't participate in a general strike. Maybe the United States is still going to support Noriega. And I think there should be an unequivocal, absolutely clear statement that gets through to the Panamanian people, where it's difficult, incidentally, to get through right now. Noriega controls the press. There's no, information is not being spread.
Two of your colleagues in the Senate, Senator Childs, a Democrat, and Senator Wilson, a Republican, also said that this report was faulty because it didn't decertify Mexico and Colombia for the same reason. Do you agree with them?
Well, I think that Mexico should have been certified as a matter of national interest. There is a clause by which the president has the right, for the interests of the United States, to certify, but not to certify by virtue of saying they are doing all in their power to cooperate or everything to stop a narcotics flow. And in fact, if you read their own certification statement, at the end of it you would say this is cause to have found another reason to help. Mexico is a very ticklish, sensitive situation. We have enormous concerns about it. There are major economic problems there. We clearly don't want to disrupt our relationship, but at the same time, we've got to send a message about the importance of the narcotics effort. And I think we should, and in fact, I know they had a debate about this, and I just think they fell on the wrong side of it.
All right. Senator, thank you. Robin?
We get a Latin American view now from Adolfo Aguilar, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a specialist in U.S.-Mexican relations. From a Latin American perspective, Mr. Aguilar, how well is the U.S. government tackling the problem of drug control in other countries?
Well, here you have an issue in which cooperation between the United States and Latin America should be very easy. The issue is very difficult to tackle, but it's something in which Latin American future is at stake, and is something that is not divisive ideologically, or there should not be perceptions that are different. Nevertheless, this has become a very thorny, conflictive issue between Latin America and the United States. And we believe is caused by several ways in which the United States has approached the struggle against drugs. The United States has assumed that Americans are the victims of drugs, and that they are the victims of drugs being produced and exported from our countries. So we are causing this damage to the United States. Also, there is the assumption that the United States has to act unilaterally, enforce these countries to cooperate with the United States. It is a bilateral issue with each one of our countries.
Well,
it is not a cooperation.
Let me take your first perception first. I mean, is it not true, certainly from the U.S. perspective, that the U.S. is a victim of these imports, and American people are victims of these drugs that are being, with great profit, imported into this country and sold here?
Well, the United States is as much as a victim as we are victims of this phenomenon. We are victims in our political institutions. We are victims in our social life. We are victims in our economic possibilities also, because it is not a sane economy based on drug activities.
Well, what should the United States be doing that it is not doing, in your view?
Well, I don't think that the United States has a clear focus of where the drug issue is in the agenda of the relations with Latin America. And second, that the instruments of policy put in place by the United States tend to be focused on the responsibilities of governments, on how these governments have to be accounted for, on how these governments have to respond to the United States demands and pressures, and not in endorsing efforts in those countries and engaging not only governments but the society in the understanding that this is a common concern of the United States and Latin America, but that it is not simply an issue in which the United States' future is at stake.
Well, let's take the case of Mexico, in which you have special expertise. You've heard that a couple of senators think that the Reagan administration should have certified Mexico today as not cooperating sufficiently. What would be the effect of that? What should the United States be doing, in your view?
Well, one of the examples of how mixed messages are sent and how confusing is the American policy towards drugs is the case of Mexico. Because we don't understand in Mexico what is the United States trying to do. One agency certifies Mexico, one other agency decertifies Mexico. Under which grounds one agency certifies Mexico and another agency thinks that we have not fully cooperated? What is the agenda of each one of these government institutions in the United States in relation to Mexico?
You mean different American agencies have different agendas, you believe?
Well, that's what the message that they sent down to Mexico, because at some point there seems to be a full understanding. The next day seems to be a completely misunderstanding between the two countries. The problem here is how you evaluate the efforts of a country. How do you measure what this country is doing and the cost that this country is absorbing in fighting drugs? It cannot be done from Washington. It cannot be done on the basis of the assessment of a single individual or in an agency or another. It has to be done with that country. It has to be involved that country. But also the principle that this country has to be certified is quite intolerable. How a country comes to the United States to say, okay, I want to be certified by you that I'm doing the right thing. This is patronizing, and these instruments don't work and poison the relationship. And I think if we judge by the way that this report is going to receive in Mexico, that this has not been helpful.
Thank you. Jim?
Is it an act of patronization, Madam Secretary?
I don't think so. I think it's a question of the administration and Congress looking out at the 24 major producer trafficking nations and trying to see where the bilateral narcotics control relationship is. It's an estimate. It's a look at where we stand in cooperation with other countries in our mutual interest, in our mutual effort to stop drugs at the source.
Senator, do you see it as a legitimate function to certify or decertify these countries?
If we're going to give aid, it is absolutely an important function.
Explain that to Mr. Aguilar. Why that's
well, let me say more importantly, leave out the issue of aid. The United States has a national security interest here. I cannot emphasize enough, and I think this is one of the things we try to do with the hearings, the impact this is having on our country and on the world. Our foreign policy interests are being altered, countries are being destabilized, governments are being lost. This report documents the Mexican corruption problem. It is clear that we can always have cooperation which allows a few people to be caught, which eradicates some crops and so forth. But this is a business, and the cost of doing business will always be written off as those few people lost in that effort. Unless you have a major effort to send people to jail and really enforce within these countries, you're not going to have anything. That's not happened in Mexico. It's not happened in the Bahamas.
Just let's think what would happen if Mexico was not certified. what will have happened?
No, but I suggested it should be certified because it's in the national interest of the United States to do it. But it is not a correct message to certify and say that there is a full cooperative effort and an adequate effort on its own to do away with trafficking and laundering as long as people don't go to jail.
But if Mexico would have not been certified and sanctions would have been applied to Mexico, it would have been self-defeating for the United States, because the sanctions that would have been applied will be aid that Mexico receives, especially to fight drugs.
And tell me what
this is the only aid that Mexico receives.
What would the
end
product be? When you say it would be self-defeating for the United States, we are being self-defeated right now by kids being born on drugs, by cops being shot in our streets, 44 people shot here. And my reaction, and I think the reaction of many other people, is to say enough. In Washington, D.C.,
Right.
all over the country.
Right.
Yeah,
My
and I think
reaction is to say enough. Now, let me tell you, in Bolivia, 1980, when a major drug trafficker at a coup, and they took over Bolivia, literally delivering the country, we came in with, we cut off the aid completely. And we then turned it around, and President Reagan came in and kept the aid cut off. President Carter first cut it off. There was a change in Bolivia. And we finally wound up in joint military operations that went after drug traffickers, and there's been cooperation. There was initially the same thing with Mexico a number of years ago. We raised serious problems after the Camarena affair. And all of a sudden there was a flurry of activity. And indeed, we were suddenly allowed to go on joint operations, which had been refused us for a long time. I believe that tough action will result in tough response.
I don't think that the question is if we should not cooperate together. I think that there are many areas in which we have to cooperate.
But it's phony right now.
And they use the resource of the United States for our war against drugs. I just say that the instruments and the approach that the United States takes politically in the way of dealing with the governments that have to be engaged in this process is poison the possibilities of
Let me ask the Secretary a question. The President of Mexico said a couple of weeks ago when he and President Reagan met, and in an interview afterward, the President of Mexico said, look, the United States has a consumption problem, and it's a mistake and it's unfair to blame our country and the other countries of Latin America by just saying it's all a supply problem. You get rid of the demand and the supply will go away.
Well, first of all, no one has ever said that the United States thinks that this is all a supply problem. We are spending an enormous amount of time and energy across the government in Washington and in the states and in cities to look at and try to get a grip on our consumption problem. Absolutely. It is a major problem for us, and we are doing everything we can to tamp down on consumption, and we're having some success.
Do you sometimes, Mr. Aguilar, feel that the United States is using Latin America as a cop-out on this?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that the debate today expressed very clearly that situation. We are debating about what is being done there in those countries, how much these countries are accountable for what they're doing. And we have very little discussion today on what is being done in the United States. Yesterday, Mrs. Reagan pointed out very clearly that you have a very major problem of consumption in this country, that something has to be done. And the front pages is what Panama is doing and not what Americans doing in their own home.
Is he right, Senator?
Not completely. Let me say respectfully that the real problem is it's both ours and theirs. And the bottom line, and I hate to say this, I'm not trying to pick on the Secretary or anything, but we don't have a war on drugs. We just don't. We haven't, I mean, if you look around the cities in this country, we haven't paid attention to education, we haven't paid attention to Head Start, we haven't paid attention to housing, we haven't paid attention to a host of things that lead inner cities into it. Secondly, you look at the whole effort with these other countries. We haven't levered these countries. I mean, I look at this report and I frankly have to laugh. I look at the Bahamas again. Nigel Bowe, major close person to the Prime Minister, mentioned significantly last year, barely mentioned this year.
You have made the point. We have barely scratched the surface, but we have to leave it there tonight.
Thank you.
Senator, Madam Secretary, Mr. Aguilar, thank you all three very much.
The Reagan administration disclosed a new program to throw a lot more money, men, and equipment into stopping the drug flow from Mexico. Operation Alliance began July 1st, but was only announced today, after yesterday's meeting between President Reagan and Mexico's Miguel de la Madrid. The two-year program will cost $266 million for sophisticated surveillance equipment, aircraft, weapons, and hundreds of new federal agents. It was announced by Vice President Bush and Attorney General Edwin Meese.
Operation Alliance will be bigger and more complex than anything we've ever done in the area of narcotics control along our land borders. It will involve more than 20 federal departments and agencies and will involve scores of state and local law enforcement agencies. It will also involve coordination with the Mexican authorities in their police activities along the border.
The American public must state unequivocally that our tolerance for drugs is over. Operation Alliance and the numerous other successful drug law enforcement initiatives launched by this administration will do their part. But the long-term solution rests squarely with the American people. And I believe public awareness of the utter destructiveness of drug abuse is at an all-time high.
In a speech today, President de la Madrid denied reports that he would allow U.S. planes to cross the border to pursue drug traffickers. He told the National Press Club that Mexico was convinced of the need for more effective cooperation, but without forces of either country crossing into the other.
As we reported earlier, the Reagan administration today unveiled a major new offensive aimed at stopping the flow of illegal drugs across the U.S.-Mexican border. The plan is expected to cost over $260 million and to involve several hundred law enforcement agents, as well as high-tech surveillance aircraft and equipment. The initiative, dubbed Operation Alliance, was formalized after talks yesterday between Mexican President de la Madrid and President Reagan. And today, details came at a press conference with Attorney General Edwin Meese.
Among the resources that are being devoted to this operation include some of the following: more than 350 new customs agents and other personnel who have been hired specifically for assignment to Operation Alliance, more than 200 FBI, DEA, and IRS agents and other personnel who are being reassigned from other posts in the country to this operation, new search and investigating authority for more than 1,000 law enforcement agents who are already stationed on the border. We are also seeking an array of new equipment, including sophisticated radar aircraft, radar balloons, and helicopters. And we are seeking 60 new federal prosecutors who will be hired specifically to handle the caseload from Operation Alliance.
In a moment, we'll be talking with an administration official and with a critic of the new anti-drug effort. But first, a look at a report we aired last spring on the extent of drug trafficking along the Southern California border. That report came from Gloria Penner of public station KPBS in San Diego.
On the border between California and Mexico, tightened surveillance against drug smuggling by the U.S. Customs Service has resulted in huge traffic backups. Up to 32,000 cars, 20,000 pedestrians, and hundreds of commercial vehicles enter the U.S. through San Ysidro every day, making this the busiest border crossing in the world. It has now become a favorite spot for drug smugglers and a national distribution point for heroin and cocaine.
We are here to announce another major seizure of cocaine along the California-Mexico border.
In the first 3 months of this year, customs agents at the San Diego-Tijuana border have confiscated 220 pounds of cocaine, over twice as much as was seized in all of 1985.
It is a modern-day horror story, and essentially the border is out of control.
What are you bringing from Mexico? ¿Qué trae de México? ¿Dónde vas?
San Isidro. Customs agents can do little more than spot checks. Drugs may be hidden in secret compartments, or some, playing the odds, have carried them barely concealed in glove boxes and trunks. Tons of fruits, vegetables, and commercial goods are brought into the U.S. every day. Customs uses a variety of methods to assist in their spot checks. Agents also keep an eye on pedestrians. They recently arrested a man with 12 ounces of heroin sewn into his underwear. The Border Patrol, as well, has apprehended illegal aliens transporting drugs across the dusty hills and trails between the ports of entry. Over 2,000 aliens a day, estimated to be 1 out of every 5, are caught attempting to enter. Even with a high rate of capture, these human mules find it pays to take the risk.
Well, basically, we're involved in a game of football. We're playing defense and the smugglers are playing offense. So they have a game plan and they have the advantage that they always have one step on us.
Despite some record-breaking seizures in Southern California, officials estimate that at best they catch only 10% of what is coming through.
Here to tell us more about the program announced today, Operation Alliance, is Stephen Trott, the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department's Criminal Division. Mr. Trott, we just heard in that report they're only catching about 10% of what is coming through. How is what you're going to do now different from what you've done in the past, and how is it going to make a dent in that?
First of all, it's going to be very personnel intensive. We intend to put, for example, another 384 customs officials working on the border by the first of the year. In addition to that, we'll have 1,000 members of the INS cross-designated to have customs authority to participate in this program. Furthermore, we intend to cover that border with aerostats balloons, which will give us 360-degree radar coverage. We hope to be able to put radar all across the border, the 1,900-mile border from the Pacific to the Gulf, extending out in the waters to stop the airplane traffic that right now is a major part of this problem.
And how much difference do you think that, I mean, how much, so you're catching 10% now, what do you think you'll stop then?
We don't know what the percentage will be. You know, drug smugglers don't file reports telling you how much they're bringing across. We know that a lot is getting through, and the intent of this operation is to stop it dead in its tracks. This is just a beginning. The relationship that we're going to be in with Mexico along that border is going to go far beyond even our lifetimes. And we're setting up a program that we think will be effective in stopping drug trafficking coming across the border.
All right, what about this new relationship with Mexico? As everyone knows, there have been some problems in the past in cooperation, getting cooperation with the Mexicans. An American drug agent was killed in Mexico last year. What is going to be different about what Mexico is going to do now that hasn't happened before?
Starting off about a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Attorney General, at the request of President Reagan, began to sit down with the Attorney General of Mexico. We've had a series of meetings, and we've established a number of concrete programs with Mexico that I think are going to make a difference. If I can just signal one, it's the drug eradication program. Since January, the drug eradication program in Mexico has really been very good. The verification of eradication flights, for example, is over 99%. We think there's a new interest in Mexico in combating the drug problem, and we're going to be working with them together in partnership to stop it.
But isn't it true that, for example, one of the things we had asked Mexico to do was to let our planes fly across the border, and according to President de la Madrid today, that isn't going to happen.
What's going to happen instead is that Mexican Customs will establish its own Air Force on their side of the border. And we've talked today about coordinating information between the two sides of the border, and then we'll revise that program if necessary as the years go by. But it is correct that air traffic is very important, and that's why we're going to put 360-degree radar all along the border.
Had you asked for permission? Is that correct, that you had asked for the Mexicans for permission to fly across the border?
We've discussed that with them, and right now our program is to work together with them in their program.
There was a report today that an American drug enforcement agent was roughed up, was mistreated by Mexican authorities in recent days. What can you tell us about that?
The information that we have so far is that a DEA agent was in fact taken into custody by apparently local police in Guadalajara. There appear to be reports that he was mistreated. He's now coming to the United States, and we will conduct a full investigation of that. We've discussed this already with the Mexican Attorney General, and they've pledged their full cooperation in getting to the bottom of this, and if any action is required, they promise us that they will take it.
And what about the, I mean, just in general, the numerous and well-publicized reports that some Mexican officials have been paid off by people who are in the drug trafficking business? Is that something that you're going to be
Yes, that is correct.
Well?
Corruption is a problem, but it's a problem on both sides of the border. The Attorney General of Mexico in the last year has taken very vigorous steps to attempt to combat this. For example, that's the only budget in Mexico in very austere times that's been increased, and they're using some of their money to pay some of the police officials bonus awards for good work done. I'm convinced on the basis of our discussions with the Attorney General that they're doing everything they can to upgrade their program. They have a long way to go, so do we. This is a very large problem. It's the traditional, it's the proverbial alligator by the tail.
Mr. Trott, we'll come back to you. Robin?
For another view, we turn to Democratic Congressman Glenn English of Oklahoma. He's chairman of the House Government Operations Subcommittee, which has oversight authority over federal border interdiction efforts. Congressman, what effect do you see the new program having?
Well, I think, first of all, let me say that I agree with the additional equipment that's being placed along the southwest border. In fact, it's identical to the proposal that Senator Dennis DeConcini and I made last April to the Vice President and was approved by the Drug Enforcement Policy Board in June. As far as the other initiatives, I think it's sadly lacking. For instance, it does nothing as far as the rest of the border is concerned. Once again, we're taking resources from other parts of the country, even South Florida, where the Attorney General said today 60% of the cocaine is coming into that region, and shifting them to the southwest border, where the media is focusing its attention these days. That means all the drug smugglers have to do is take a hard right and come in over the Gulf, and they're going to have the same easy access that they've had all along. Unless we put together an entire package that addresses the entire southern border, then obviously we're simply forcing the drug smuggler from one region of the country to the next.
Are you accusing the administration of simply putting the resources where the media is paying attention?
I think that's exactly what's been happening. For instance, we need 850 additional people as far as the Customs Service is concerned to do that job. As it stands today, in air operations, they can only operate 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That means 2/3 of the time there are no aircraft up there interdicting the smugglers. There's nothing in this plan that has been advanced today that is going to move towards a 16-hour, 7-day-a-week proposal that the Customs Service has been striving for in their 5-year package.
You mean even with all this increased personnel and the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service, people being able to perform customs duty, even that won't give this coverage?
Those are not pilots. I was particularly interested in your focus on the ground. 60% of all the cocaine coming in this country is coming in by air, not on the ground. Most of the rest is coming in by ship, and the same is true as far as marijuana. So what you focused on there was a very small percentage of the actual amount coming in. Second, as far as the cooperation of Mexico, unless we've got hot pursuit, which evidently we do not have, I see that the actions by Mexico is going to have little or no impact. Keep in mind that the aircraft that they're talking about are highly unlikely to be equipped with a look-down type radar, namely this kind of radar that you have in an F-16 or a FLIR radar, which can see at night. And over 90% of the drugs that are smuggled in this country come in at night. So unless Mexico has interceptors equipped in that manner, they're simply not going to be able to respond, and therefore they're useless.
Did you see the Mexican refusal to permit hot pursuit by American planes across the border as indicating that the cooperation is not really very significant?
That's exactly what I see. I don't think Mexico is responding. I think the administration's been very weak in bringing pressure to bear on the Mexican government. And I think that unless we get cooperation from Mexico, it's highly unlikely that we're going to see much of an impact from their side of the border. I do think, though, that this new initiative will move drug smugglers away from the southwest border, but it's certainly going to increase in the Gulf area. It's going to increase in West Florida, probably even increase in South Florida.
Finally, if you proposed, as you said, with Senator DeConcini, exactly this program some months ago, and yet you're now saying that it's very inadequate. What does that say about the program you proposed, and what would be adequate?
Well, they lifted out only that portion that applies to the southwest border. They did not include the rest of the package as it addressed itself to the rest of the border. And that's exactly what's wrong with the package. They didn't take the entire package. They only took that portion that the press is looking at today.
So what would the cost be for the entire package?
The entire package that we put forth, and keep in mind this was in response to the bipartisan call that the Speaker and the Minority Leader have had in the House, a complete package addressing all the needs along the southern border would be in the neighborhood of $900 million, or to simply take the administration's figures that they're putting forth on the southwest border and apply that to the rest of the border.
Well, thank you. Judy?
Well, Mr. Trott, he raised a number of objections, or rather criticisms, to what you're doing. First of all, he says you're putting your resources just simply in a place where you think the media is going to give you the most attention.
Well, that's a bunch of nonsense, and I think the congressman knows it. We're placing the resources where we believe they're necessary to combat the problem. We're convinced that this is a program that's going to be effective, or we wouldn't be putting it in. And let me say a few words about the southeast border. The congressman is right. What happens when you put an operation in one area is the drug smugglers move someplace else. And that's why the National Drug Enforcement Policy Board, under the direction of the Attorney General, is studying the southeast, and we plan to enhance our capabilities there also. But I think this raises a very interesting point, and that is that all the law enforcement efforts, all the interdiction efforts in the world are not going to make a long-lasting dent on this problem until we do something to reduce the demand for drugs in this country. When we sit down with the Mexicans, they say, we may be growing marijuana in the United States, but you're in Mexico, but you're buying it in the United States. And they're right. And that's why the President and the First Lady and everybody is now out to get the word out to the American people.
I understand that, but this specific effort is directed at drugs coming across the border,
That's
and you
right.
are focusing on the Southwest. Now, come back to you,
we're not
Congress.
focusing just on the Southwest. We're focusing all across the entire border.
But Congressman English's point is that the smugglers are going to move to the right. They're going to come in the Gulf and into Florida.
And that's why we're looking at the southeast border also, because I agree with that point.
If I could respond, there's nothing in this proposal that would address the southeast border at all. It is focused entirely on the southwest border. And unless the issue of personnel is addressed, particularly pilots, we're going to have another 350 additional pilots just to bring us up to that 16 hours a day. And keep in mind, as I said, right now, the Customs Service is not flying 2/3 of the time, even during those 5 days.
All right, what about that point? He's saying that we're unprotected much of the time.
That's inaccurate. The National Narcotics Border Interdiction System, which has been up and running for 4 years, is active all along the Gulf Coast. It's active all along all the border area of the United States. The South Florida Drug Interdiction Task Force has been operational now for 5 or 6 years. We're stepping up our efforts along the southwest border, and NIMBUS, as it's known, has been operational and continues to be operational.
Which is?
National Narcotics Border Interdiction System, which is a vice presidential initiative to stop the flow of drug trafficking across our borders down south.
He says you're wrong.
Okay, let me respond very quickly. I think the General Accounting Office pointed out that the National Narcotic Border Interdiction System has absolutely nothing. It's simply a paper organization. It has no budget. It has no personnel whatsoever. It simply has people assigned. It does nothing as far as the air interdiction system. And that's what we're talking about here is air interdiction. And the issue that comes down to us are pilots, aircraft. We have today detection aircraft, and there are only 4 detection aircraft for the entire Customs Service. We have today aircraft sitting on the ground because the administration has not hired personnel to pilot those aircraft.
Is that true?
Let me follow up on one other point, too. As far as interceptors.
Well, let me ask him to respond to that point before you move on to the next one.
Judy, I don't know whether we have 4 aircraft right now sitting on the ground. What I do know is that we have a commitment to address this problem with the resources and the will that's necessary. But in the final analysis, the answer to this problem, I think, lies with the American people. They have the will to change the attitude that's going to get us out of this hole.
I would like to go back to that issue of a commitment and report and to address the President's own budget, in which he stated in here that a rescission of $19 million for the Customs Air Interdiction Program for 1986. He says this reduction eliminates marginal congressional add-ons, which happen to be the aerostat that we're talking about.
Rescission means he was talking about cutting back money
correct,
for the program.
Which addresses the aerostat.
And when was this? This was earlier this year?
This was earlier this year. They announced the aerostat. This was one of the initiatives they talked about today. Detection aircraft as well, and said these additional expenditures for the program had not proven cost-effective. So they were already cutting funds.
So you're cutting
first
money,
year.
is that?
The Congressman has a blue book. I can tell you that the Customs Service will have 384 new customs officers out of 1986 money up and functional on the border about the first of the year.
So someone in the administration changed his mind about this during the year, is that correct? At one point the decision was to cut back, and now the decision is to put money out.
Nobody ever changed their mind about the importance of the southwest border. This is a plan that's been under study for some time. Our objective is not just to throw money at a program, to make sure we're spending the taxpayers' dollars efficiently so that every dollar results in a dollar's value in terms of stopping drug trafficking coming across the border.
What about the Congressman's other point about Mexico, that without this hot pursuit ability, that your effectiveness is greatly cut back?
I don't think that's true at all. But, you know, getting out of my skin as an administration official, you have to recognize that you're dealing with the sovereignties of countries, and you have to view this from 2 sides. If other countries were to come to the United States, for example, and say, you have a problem with drug users, we want to send our troops into your country to catch drug users, I think we would say, well, there are sovereignty issues here that have to be looked at very carefully. And I think what the Mexican government is doing is saying, let's respect each other's sovereignty, let's work together in a bilateral partnership and conquer these problems.
What about
Let me address that. In the Bahamas right now, we're working a hot pursuit cooperation. We have Bahamian officials on U.S. aircraft with U.S. Law enforcement officers. That's how hot pursuit operates. Mexico has refused to carry that out. They've refused to even allow us overflight authority with detection aircraft. So we have no cooperation, and this administration has refused to bring pressure to bear against Mexico.
On the other side of the coin, the Mexican Drug Eradication Program is functioning with the State Department, with DEA, and it's never been better. They are knocking down crops in Mexico at an unprecedented rate. And every time a marijuana field is destroyed or a heroin field is destroyed, or a cocaine arrest goes down in Mexico, our country and Mexico benefits.
The congressman also pointed out, though, that so many of these, if not most of these illegal shipments are coming across by air at night, and the Mexican planes won't have this nighttime surveillance
This is why we're putting in aerostats to be backed up by E2Cs.
What are aerostats?
An aerostat is that's a good question, especially for the viewer. It's a gigantic balloon that's tethered to a base. It'll probably sit up at an altitude, maybe it's classified, I'm not supposed to say, somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, and it puts out a 360-degree radar. With 5 of these and radar airplanes, we believe that we will have the coverage to spot all airplanes coming in across that border. Then, of course,
all airplanes coming across the 2,000-mile border.
And that will give us the capacity then to utilize the resources to bring them down and to make sure that they're not drug traffickers. And if they are, to stop them. I think we agree that this has to happen.
That's exactly the point. We have staging areas south in El Paso, and I'll be happy to point them out to you if the DEA needs any additional information where those are located, which are really operating as staging areas. There's no question about where they're located. Mexico knows where they are. They simply are not taking action against them. Second, we only have 8 interceptors for the entire nation to respond to this threat.
When you say interceptor, you mean?
I'm talking about aircraft that are vectored in to pick up the smuggler aircraft and are able to follow them. And I should say properly equipped aircraft. There are only 8 for the entire nation.
But
Excuse
this
me, 6 for the
program
entire
is to
nation.
add aircraft,
That's
isn't it?
exactly right, but you don't see interceptors as a part in that. You have 4 E2Cs, which are detection-type aircraft. You have 5
what's the difference
aerostats.
between those and the...
Because one is does the detecting, the other is the one that follows the smuggler to the point that he's willing to land. And let me also say we only have 8 helicopters to carry law enforcement officials to the scene to make the bust.
For somebody who doesn't know much about it, that doesn't sound like very many aircraft.
Let me make another point, Judy. This is a program that's being implemented right now. It won't be up and fully operational for at least 18 months to 2 years. And what we plan to do as we go along by adding resources is to make sure that every eventuality is covered. And if the congressman turns out to be correct in his predictions and we don't have enough interceptor aircraft, you can bet your bottom dollar we'll be back to the congressman to ask for money. I might point out another thing. The House of Representatives tried to cut our budget for United States attorneys by $30 million recently. How are we going to prosecute the people we're going to catch?
But on the time point, are you willing to give them time on
Well,
this?
no, we've been giving them 5 years now. This has been brought to their attention. We've had 5 years of hearings, 38 hearings, which we've pointed out each and every one of these shortages and each and every addition, every piece of aircraft, every boat that has been added in the last 5 years has either been without the help or over the objections of the administration.
And our budget gets cut 5%.
Well, this is one I know we're going to come back to, gentlemen. Mr. Trott, Mr. English, thank you both for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.